Have you ever heard of the term male pattern blindness? You thought I was going to say baldness, didn't you? No, blindness. Have you ever heard that term, male pattern blindness? What do you think that is just from the way it sounds? Can't see. Yeah, that's good. Genetic? What was that, Bob? You don't pay attention. That's pretty close. That's pretty close to it. Bob knows. I actually have an example of it that we're going to watch a video on it, as long as the sound for the computer's on. I'll give Jamie a second to turn that on.
Hey, have you seen my blue shirt?
Did you look?
Of course I looked. I'm looking right now.
Let me see.
I'm telling you, it's not in
You
there.
mean this blue shirt?
Give me that. I don't know what kind of witchcraft you just pulled, but it was not in there just a second ago. I looked all through that drawer.
Really?
I looked all through that drawer.
You never look.
Have you or someone you know been the victim of male pattern blindness? You may be entitled to compensation, or at least an apology. This is the idea that a man can walk right past something, or I shouldn't limit it to men, but that's my experience, that a man can walk right past something without ever seeing it. Now, it's confusing to spouses at best and a level 5 or 10 frustration at worst. Why? Because they cannot understand how in the world something that's in front of your eyes can go undetected. Now, that kind of behavior, I think, is very similar to the idea of tunnel vision, where you are so focused on what is immediately in front of you that you miss everything else that's going around you. Now, sometimes that can be very beneficial. It can help you focus, right? But there are some times when life is just hitting us right here and we cannot see the bigger picture because we're so focused on what's in front of us. I just had a conversation after the board meeting that, I went to a training once about if an active shooter were to come into your building, like what are some things you could do. But they talked about how they interview these these shooters when they're no longer active. But they interview them and say, what did you see when you were doing it? And most shooters, because of the adrenaline and everything, they only remember seeing their gun and what's immediately in front of it. They block out everything around it. So in that case, it's a good idea to attack from the side because they usually can only see where the gun is pointing. They have a tunnel vision and it gives them focus only to what they're doing. But sometimes in times of crisis or an emergency, our adrenaline gives us tunnel vision to help us survive, but it can also hurt us because we don't get to see the larger picture of what's going on around us. Whether it's tunnel vision or male pattern blindness, what these things demonstrate is that what we see is often limited to what is going on just right in front of us, or maybe even what's going on around us. We don't see the bigger picture. Now, this is the fourth and the final week of our series, Taking on Water, that focuses on the ways that compromise can impact our journey of following Jesus. Because often what seems like no big deal or just normal, like what everyone else is doing, allows water to fill and eventually sink the proverbial ship of our own life. Now today we're going to spend time looking at Jesus' disciple, Judas. Now we're going to begin in John chapter 12. You're welcome to turn there as I continue to talk before we get there. But the context of John chapter 12 at large, the bigger context or story of what's going on, is Jesus and his disciples have come to Jerusalem. Now, Jesus knew that going to Jerusalem would certainly mean his capture and his death. It was dangerous for Jesus to go to Jerusalem, but this isn't the time that what drew him back to Jerusalem was the death of his friend Lazarus, if you know that story. So he travels because Lazarus is sick and eventually he raises him from the dead. So he goes, puts himself in harm's way so that he can raise Lazarus. Now that took place, and now this group of Jesus and his disciples, they're in the home of Lazarus. They're sharing a meal. Lazarus' sister Martha is a great host, but her sister Mary is a little different. And so that's where we pick up the story. John chapter 12, beginning in the 3rd verse. It says, Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, "That perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor." Not that he cared for the poor, he was a thief, and since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. In this story, what we see is Mary takes the most valuable thing that she had. I mean, that thing was worth a year's wages, and she broke it open and used it on Jesus. That's a whole sermon in itself, and we could spend time there and all that kind of stuff, but that's not the focus of this message. So let's take instead note of Judas's response. First, he assumes his point of view is from a position of knowledge, and so he criticizes her act. Judas believes that he knows better, so he can't sit there in silence. He has to share his thoughts on it. Do you know anyone like this? Someone does something and they roll their eyes and they say, "You shouldn't have done that. There's a much better way to do that." I mean, I've never met anybody like that. Okay, I'm joking. I have. I've been that person before, so I see that. That response, though, that says, "You shouldn't have done that, there was something better to do," assumes that they have all the facts about contributing factors to the situation in front of them. That response assumes that their point of view doesn't suffer from any blind spots or tunnel vision, but they have a firm grasp on the whole picture, and they're saying, "You did it wrong." Judas saw it as a waste, but he offers an alternative of selling it and giving the money to the poor. Now that sounds pretty noble, doesn't it? I mean, let's be honest, people without are always telling people with how they should do things, even though they've never been in that position themselves. I talk about this all the time, about how I was the best parent I ever was before I had kids, right? Then reality hits you. That's true with money sometimes too. People have an opinion on what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing, and that doesn't continue sometimes, or that doesn't dry up even with that. But sometimes they come up with very noble things of like, "Oh, if I ever won the lottery, I would give it all to the church." Right? You ever heard anybody say that? Then they win a scratch off for $10, and then they use it to buy more scratch offs, and you're like, "Wait, if you won the lottery, you're giving it to the church." "Oh, that's only if it gets to a certain amount." Anyway, I digress. It sounds pretty noble to say something like, you should give that to the poor, but John lets us in on a little secret. Judas doesn't care about the poor. Judas was stealing from the treasury. He cares about money, and that's what he cares about. Even if he hadn't been stealing, though, Mary's deed was done. There was no Judas saying, "Hey, you shouldn't have done that." She's like, "Oh, sorry, let me piece this back together and scoop it back in." No, it's already done, so offering any kind of counsel at that point is pointless. It was already done. But it proves a good point. Doing something for Jesus that isn't practical doesn't make sense to Judas. And there are times it won't make sense when you follow Jesus either, and there will be people that have a comment for you about what you should have done instead. It just happens. Good-meaning, well-meaning people will tell you how you should be following Jesus different, or even why you're following Jesus in an impractical way. Right? I just got to sit. Our district has a thing called POPs, Pastors on Purpose. It's once a month. I went to Bloomington for that on Thursday. And there's a big long story about how there's this building, this church that was a church plant, had been meeting in this one building for like 9 years, and they felt like they should leave that, and they met in someone's home for a couple years, but they were praying, "God, we need a building." Well, then this 120-year-old Methodist church came up for sale, this huge building. They're like, "We could never afford that." But they said, they encouraged the pastor, "Just go tell them what we have and maybe God will work it out." And they said, "Okay." He said, "Hey, don't laugh at me. I know this property is worth over $1 million. We have about $10,000 we could come up with." And they said, "Sold." You got it. Because they'd shared the vision of what they wanted, how they wanted to minister to that community. Now, if that wasn't just wow enough, right? It wasn't very practical. Can you imagine people telling that church, "You could have got at least $500,000, if not $1 million. That's not practical to sell it for $10,000. What about him? "Oh, go in there and offer $10,000? That's an insult." Or, "Hey, we could use that $10,000 for a need we have." Anyway, not even a week later, the pastor told the story about how a couple met with him and said, "Pastor, we fully believe in you and this vision of going into a new building, and someone recently passed away, and they had this investment account we didn't know about. They left it to us. Here's $17,000. I hope that helps with the building. Boom, building was paid for, and they were able to use that $7,000 then to do some upkeep and some things they needed to do to the building. That doesn't make practical sense. Imagine being somebody, and you told somebody, I gave $17,000 to the church. They say, you just blew your money. They don't see it that way. They see it as an investment for years to come into what God is doing in and through that church. They see it as they receive this blessing from God, and so they in turn use that for the mission of God. Is it practical? No. They didn't even know how much the building cost. They just gave it without even knowing, and the pastor got to tell them, you just paid for our whole building. Doing something for Jesus doesn't always make sense to everybody else, but that's what obedience looks like. We're going to hop over into Matthew 26 to continue the story, and here's what we read in Matthew 26, verse 10. But Jesus, aware of this, being the reply that Judas had, replied, why criticize this woman for doing such a good thing to me? I tell you the truth, wherever the good news is preached throughout the world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the leading priests and asked, how much will you pay me to betray Jesus to you? And they gave him 30 pieces of silver. From that time on, Judas began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus. Wow, that escalated pretty quickly, didn't it? Judas went from criticizing to full-on betrayal now. He went from making commentary about what was going on to taking control of what was happening and inserting himself into the story. Judas had transitioned from skimming money off the top. Now he's just completely selling out. But that's typical of what will sink our battleship of life. A progression from one seemingly small thing that's no big deal eventually to something that becomes a big deal. Because most people don't make that leap automatically. It's usually small steps that they look back and said, how did I get here? And we look back and say, oh, it's all these little decisions instead of one big decision. Now, I don't know for sure what Judas's motivation was. It's been discussed and talked about all over the place, but I know a few humans. In fact, I am one. And I know of typical human behavior that can inform the possibility of some of his motivation. I think one possibility is a rationalization of what we're entitled to. Sometimes we rationalize that we're entitled to something. It usually doesn't take many steps to go from doing something with really good intentions to shifting to what I deserve for doing that thing. Right? Sometimes we start out with innocent and say, hey, I'll do this, and we do it a few times and we're just like, you know what? This is hard work. I deserve something, some recognition. I deserve some kind of payback for all the things I've been doing. I can easily imagine Judas was a very good accountant and treasurer because he was skilled at this. He volunteered to take this on for the group. I believe that he must have been skilled in that way for them to trust him with the money. But as time passed, he began taking some of the money, maybe not because he had bad intentions, but because it would have been normal for a treasurer or an accountant to be paid for their work. And so he may have just justified it for all the hard work that he did. He deserved what he took. He just said, oh, this is what they would have paid somebody anyway. I deserve this. It's been hard work. He may have said to himself, they should have given me a salary, but they had no idea really what that role entails. And so it's their mistake. I'm just correcting it for them without maybe them knowing, right? It's really their fault. I'm just so nice that I'm going to correct it for them without them knowing. It was a small compromise to begin with. He was kind of just skimming off the top. But as time went on, it became easier and easier to justify it as he was just doing what was fair. A lot of times we like to justify what we do rather than admit that what we did was wrong. This is the epitome of our series because this is taking on water and it's making small compromises that reduce our integrity and allows the way of the world and the way of sin to spill into our life and into the heart of a follower of Jesus. Is that we justify it as what we deserve, or we justify it as no big deal. As problematic as justifying that it was perfectly okay to do this, though, it doesn't stop there. Instead, it led to seeking even more money. I don't think if Judas had not taken the money from the treasury of the group that he would have approached the chief priest. But I believe there's a slide that happens. There's steps that happen that as you start to justify it, you allow for bigger and bigger things. It becomes easier and easier. But that's kind of how taking on water in our life works. If you get comfortable with what's going on, then it allows for it to continue to get worse. It'll often push you over the edge. To put it another way, what I'm saying is compromise and justification takes us from not that bad to eventually how in the world did we ever get here? I want to tell you about two quick examples. One was a treasurer I heard of in Pennsylvania at a church, Nazarene church, and they were doing bookkeeping and it was a lot of work. Well, it was a volunteer position and they as time went on, they felt like, man, this is hard work, and they needed some money because their husband got hurt at work and they were out of money. And they said, well, they should have paid me for what I've been doing anyway, so I'm going to take some of this money and help us out. Over the course of, I think it's something like 4 or 5 years, they had taken about $80,000. So if you think about that, if they were taking about $10,000 a year, or $20,000 a year, that would not be that very good for a salary, right? And so they probably thought, like, it's no big deal. I'm just taking what's fair. But it's not very good for someone who's just taking it, right? The person was found out, their life was ruined. Another church in Detroit, another Nazarene church, they had an IRS agent as a treasurer. Who better to know accounting than an IRS agent? Dedicated to the church, treasurer for 20 or 25 years. Eventually they found out had taken something like $9 million from the church. It's easy to look at that and be like, how could they get there? I'm sure when they started, they never started with that end dollar amount in mind. But it started with little compromises to say, it's not that bad. I deserve this. I rightfully just took something that they probably owed me anyway. But I'm sure at some point they said, how in the world did I get here? I never intended to be here. The other place that compromise and rationalization or justification takes place in the church a lot of times is in a compromise and allocation of resources. Those are kind of a fancy way of saying something. You might say, what do you mean by that? And I'm saying, I'm glad you asked. You're so inquisitive. I love it. Helps me on Sunday. This is the compromise that says, I do blank for Jesus, so I believe he'll be okay if I do this other thing. Whatever that blank may be. This typically shows up in one of two ways that I've seen it in my short time as a pastor, not just a pastor here, so I'm talking about my other churches, not you guys, so don't worry, you can take the week off, right? Maybe. So what people say is, I give money in the offering, so I believe that Jesus is okay if I don't do all the other stuff he says. Right? There are certain people that I've talked to, and they said, you know what? I don't really have time to get involved in the mission of Jesus. I don't really have time to follow that stuff, but I give to the church, so I'm good. Me and God have an understanding. He leaves me alone, I give money to the church, and we're good. The other way, it says, I don't give tithe or offering, but Jesus is okay with that because I give my time, and my time's worth a lot. I do a lot for the church, but I just don't give any money. And, a lot of times as a pastor, you start mentioning money and people get itchy and they're saying, should you be talking about this? And I have no problem talking about it because I believe it's not a money issue, it's a spiritual issue. And so if we have a generous God, then we give to him all of our resources, which includes money and time. That's what following Jesus looks like. And so what we say is I do all these kinds of things, and I think if Jesus is okay in the area where I sin, by doing something he says it's not okay because I do so much on the other side, it's like we create our own scale to say, you know what? I've weighted down the scale with my good works so much so that the sin is only like, the scale doesn't even move because I do so much good over here. You know what we would call that though? A lack of integrity. It's saying you're trying to get by on half of it. You're viewing this as a transaction, not as a way of life, but as like we're finding little loopholes to get through, and we're making little deals with ourselves. We're brokering things with God to say, hey, I'll do this, but I won't do that. But you'll be okay with that, right? Because I'm doing so much of this. I've heard many people tell me, I don't tithe, I don't give an offering because I tithe and give of my time. Please find that in Scripture for me. There are people that say, I write a check every week, but I don't do anything with my time involving God. Please find that in Scripture. I'm open to it. I'm open to that I could have this whole thing wrong. But again, I'm talking to people watching online that go to my former churches, not anybody here, so we can move on. We start to say things don't apply to us because we balance it out with doing way more than normal in other areas. We create ourselves as a special clause. It's easy for me to imagine Judas doing this to focus on why he's valid and what he does instead of seeing the compromise that is causing his life to take on the water of sin because it's human nature. Because I've done it before. Because I've witnessed it before in others. Because others have come to me and confessed that they've done it. This kind of thinking that I'm okay over here where I don't listen because I've listened in so many other areas is common to the human experience where we were more worried about being right than we are about being made right by Jesus. We're more worried about checking the boxes instead of saying, I don't want to do anything that would fracture my relationship with my beloved Creator. A lot of times we're focused on making ourselves right, and we don't see it as self-justification. We don't see it as self-righteousness, and that's how we take on water. Sinking below the life that Jesus came to offer us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Now, in the story of Judas, things are further revealed. If any of that bothered you that I talked about, and you're saying, I don't agree with that, come and talk to me. I'm happy to talk to you about it. Not in an angry way, but just like if you're saying, oh, well, I think tithing was just an Old Testament thing. Well, in the New Testament, they sold everything and gave it. So if you want to go that route, we can have that talk. People online, right? Not here. People online. We can talk. Email me. I got you. In John, sorry, that's just me. That's my sense of humor. In John 13, things are further revealed about Judas. It's the night that Jesus is arrested. Before that happens, though, Jesus and his disciples, they meet together for the Passover meal. You remember this from like all of our Easter time and our stories that we talk about. Now, what does Jesus do with his disciples? He washes their feet, their stinky, dirty, infected feet, which reveals the nature of God as one of self-sacrificing love. Right? Because Jesus says, you're going to do what I do. This is a symbolic act to reveal that God is this. It's the nature of God. Self-sacrificing love is the nature of God. And then Jesus says, you're going to do this too. And he says you're going to go wash feet, and what people think is like, oh, I go and wash people's feet. Well, it's, yes, wash people's feet, but really it's symbolic. That I'll get down, I'll get my hands dirty. I'll get in the trenches with people and I'll wash their feet. Judas either doesn't see it because he has tunnel vision, looking for something else, or he saw it and he was disappointed because he wanted something else. Regardless, he doesn't want what Jesus came to accomplish, and it's demonstrated through his actions in John 13. Verse 21, now Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at each other, wondering whom he could mean. The disciple Jesus loved, who John always refers to himself that way, which I think is very nice of John to call himself that. But the disciple that Jesus loved was sitting next to Jesus at the table. Simon Peter motioned to him to ask, who's he talking about? So that disciple leaned over to Jesus and said, Lord, who is it? Jesus responded, it is the one to whom I give the bread I dip in the bowl. And when he had dipped it, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. When Judas had eaten the bread, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus told him, hurry and do what you're going to do. Yikes. Judas had compromised so much so, He had taken on so much water on his life that Satan felt welcome to enter him, according to John. He'd gotten so far that there was room for Satan to come in. Oh, he'd been following Jesus literally. I mean, he wasn't just doing this on like a spiritual way of, hey, I'm following the way of Jesus. He had literally been walking with Jesus for the better part of 3 years, but he couldn't see or he didn't want to see what Jesus was really about. It isn't difficult to imagine that Judas's mind was focused on the immediate future of the Roman captivity, of all the things that were going on in his life, on what was stressing him out more than his big plans for Jesus. Jesus had this big plan for what he was doing, but it wasn't lining up to what Judas wanted. The world around Judas told him there were more pressing things that needed dealt with than whatever it was that Jesus was doing. He's saying there's much more going on than what Jesus is doing. Just like the world around you and me will tell us every waking minute that there are more pressing things to focus on instead of what Jesus is doing. It'll tell us that all. Turn on the news, and there are 300 things to scare you to death that have nothing to do with what Jesus is doing, and saying, you know what? I have bills due tomorrow. That's more pressing than what Jesus wants to do. What he wants to do is going to take a long time. I got stuff due tomorrow. You know what? Just this week, people have said the following. It's not me, so don't get mad at me if I talk about your favorite person. People have said, Biden is too old. He can't do anything. We need to get him out of there. Then there's all other people that say Trump is too corrupt. We need to take care of Trump. There's violence in Israel's Gaza Strip. There's violence over in the Ukraine. There's all these news stories that tell you this is going on with the Pope, and this is going on with this person, and this is secretly going on, and nobody knows about it, but then somehow this person secretly has insight into it. And we get so caught up in all the stuff that needs focus that sometimes we're saying there are more pressing things going on. There are more things frightening us than Jesus and what he wants. And that's the lie of our life, is that we need to focus on what's happening right now more than we need to focus on Jesus. And so the story that we're continually being told is the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and we better take care of it right now. Meanwhile, Jesus is saying, the tomb is empty. I'm on the throne, and I am making all things new. Are things bad? Yes. But I'm making them new, and I have a plan. And heaven and earth will not, joining together, like the book of Revelation tells us, will not be stopped by whatever the world is telling you. And so really what I believe that Jesus is telling us is don't lose focus. Yes, these things aren't unimportant. They're important, and those opinions are valid, and whatever you think about all those things, that's fine. I'm not telling you not to think of those things, but I'm telling you, don't get caught up and get tunnel vision of what's happening, that you miss out what Jesus is doing. Some people will say, who has time for a God who's in process when there are tangible needs right in front of us? Who has time to wait for the day that the Lamb comes and makes it his way? Because what we need right now is the lion. We want God to be the lion, don't we? We say, come and take care of all of our enemies. Come and take care of all these things. God, you can take care of all of this. Just come as the lion. We've had enough of the lamb. It doesn't really take care of things. Not you, just other people. Maybe Judas thought he was going to flush Jesus out of these secret rooms and onto the earthly throne. Maybe Judas assumed he could see the big picture of what we really needed, even if Jesus couldn't. Maybe he just wanted to help him out a little bit. I don't know. But his tunnel vision told him a lot of different lies, motivating him to steal and eventually to selling out Jesus. Sometimes the pressure of what's going on right now, of what might happen tomorrow, of 1,000 things that might happen to you, that pressure can give us tunnel vision, where God can be doing something right in front of us or around us, but we don't see it. Why? Because it doesn't look like what we expected it to look like, or because it's taking too much time and we get impatient. And so when our expectations for God don't stay flexible and adjust because of the possibility that we don't know everything, see everything, or do everything like God, then we will be tempted to abandon what he's doing for what we think needs done. Have you ever got to the point where you felt like you just need to help out God a little bit? I have. I'll take that leap. I have. I prayed to God and saying, God, I'm not hearing from you, so I'm assuming you're cool. Let me help you out a little bit. You are so much further along than me, and I'm thankful for that. Pray for me. I need grace. I can imagine Judas had too many pressing ideas about what needed to happen instead of being surrendered to what God was doing in front of him through Jesus. And because of that, he left a seat at the table of his life open to Satan to enter his life and to start speaking at his table. Friends, can we be honest and say you and I rarely, if ever, can see the whole and complete picture of what's going on? Let alone can we know all the different things there are to know. That's the best part about coaching volleyball. I meet kids who know everything at 12. And I tell them, you might know as much as a 12-year-old could know, but that's all you know. Sometimes as adults we need reminded of that we don't know it all and we don't see it all. We are not God who can see all and know all. So it's important for us to trust his sight and his knowledge to provide a perspective only he can provide on what choices lead us to fully living life as it was designed by him. I want to head towards the finish line with this story. In the first book of C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, it's called The Magician's Nephew. It's like a prequel. It doesn't matter when it was written, but anyway. We meet two characters, Uncle Andrew, a supposed magician, and Diggory, his nephew. At one point, Uncle Andrew tricks Diggory's friend Polly with a magic ring. And Uncle Andrew begins explaining how he got the ring. He says, old Mrs. LaFay gave a box to me and made me promise that as soon as she was dead, I would burn it unopened with certain ceremonies. That promise I did not keep. Well, then it was jolly rotten of you, says Diggory. Rotten? Said Uncle Andrew with a puzzled look. Oh, I see. You mean that little boys ought to keep their promises. Very true. Most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you have been taught to do it. But of course, you must understand that rules of that sort, however excellent they may be for little boys and servants and women and even people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No, Diggory, men like me who possess hidden wisdom are freed from common rules just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. All it means, Diggory said to himself, is that he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. I'm not sure what all Judas thought, but I wouldn't be surprised if he were like Uncle Andrew and many people who have rationalized away the rules of that sort, just like Uncle Andrew did. And saying, sure, that they don't apply to me because I have a special waiver. You know, God and I are good. We have an agreement. And so they can do what makes sense to them so they can get what they want, whether it's something they've concluded they are entitled to with a simple, I deserve to be happy too, or it's a result that makes whatever they're doing to get there justified by whatever means it takes. So often we read stories of people like Judas and we shake our heads at that and say, how could they do that? All while justifying the water that we've taken on in our own lives and saying it's no big deal. The life and demise of Judas has the potential to warn us of that kind of thinking, though. To help us recognize that often our tunnel vision of the immediate issue or on the single thing we think will make everything better may be ignoring the larger picture of the work that God is doing in and around us. The temptation to create a loophole, to disobey God, to live contrary to his way because it'll be better in the end, is a way of living that separates us from living in a relationship with Jesus. When we create our own loopholes that we don't find in Scripture, then it's going to separate us from Jesus. Jesus was surrendered to the Father's will. Judas was surrendered to his own will. What will you and I be surrendered to? Let us be a people who don't just proclaim love for Jesus, but a people who earnestly are leaning into living out that love. If there are areas of our lives where we've rationalized and justified it being okay, let's seek God's direction. Surrender to what He says about them. Just earnestly put them there before God and saying, God, should I continue that or not? And it may not always be easy, but it'll be better because His ways will keep us from taking on water. His ways will have us, instead of water, to take on the mind of Christ. His ways will help us, instead of being filled with things that separate us from Him, to being filled with His Holy Spirit, which will draw us into communion with Him. And so not only should we pay attention that we stay with integrity away from things that will kind of cause us to sink, we also need to turn to focus to what we are supposed to be walking towards, not just what we're walking away from, and that's Jesus. And so it can easily become legalistic to say, I got to keep the water out, I got to keep the water out. But we hold that intention with a relationship with Jesus and saying, I'm following you, what should I do? Let's not just come up with a list of what not to do. Let's live into the life of what we should be doing, following Jesus. Will you stand with me? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this opportunity and for the reality